What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here on the Max Afterburner channel. I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown Boeing 737s and Airbus A220s as an airline pilot for years, and I've covered the Iran and Kuwait invasion threat on this channel before, but there's genuinely new information since then that I think changes the picture enough to warrant a fresh, updated breakdown. I want to walk you through what's actually happened to Kuwait since this war started, the new reporting about how Iran allegedly used an earlier ceasefire to coordinate with its regional proxies, the latest threats against energy infrastructure across the entire Gulf, and then give you my updated read on how seriously to take the invasion threat itself. So my goal today is a few things. First, I want to give you the actual documented toll this war has already taken on Kuwait, because I think a lot of people don't realize just how much fighting has already happened there, well, short of any actual invasion. Second, I want to walk through this new reporting about Iran using the April ceasefire period to coordinate with Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias, because that's a genuinely significant new detail that speaks directly to how this conflict keeps expanding. And third, I'll give you my honest, updated assessment on the invasion threat itself. Now that we have a few more weeks of developments to look at, let's start with what's already happened to Kuwait, because I think this context is essential before we even get to the invasion question. Since Iran began launching retaliatory strikes on American and Kuwaiti targets back on February 28th, when this war first started, Kuwait has absorbed a genuinely brutal amount of direct combat. Documented losses include 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones that Kuwaiti and Allied air defenses have shot down, 7 American soldiers killed and dozens wounded in these attacks, and 4 service members killed with 77 wounded in a separate incident. A CH-47 Chinook helicopter was destroyed. Kuwait's own Ministry of Defense has reported 67 Kuwaiti service members wounded over the course of this conflict, and 2 Kuwaiti Navy servicemen were killed in the line of duty. There was also an Iranian missile attack that targeted a makeshift operations center near the civilian port of Shuaiba, killing 6 U.S. soldiers and wounding dozens more, with 38 hospitalized. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait was likely hit by an Iranian missile strike as well, and in a genuinely tragic mistake, an F-18 belonging to Kuwait's own Air Force shot down 3 American F-15Es in a friendly fire incident, though thankfully the American aircrew survived that. Even Canadian forces stationed at Camp Canada, located within Ali Al Salem Air Base, took incoming Iranian missile fire. Sheltering in bunkers that satellite imagery later showed had sustained damage, an incident that actually generated its own controversy back home in Canada over how transparent the government was being about it. I wanted to walk through all of that in detail because I think it's genuinely important context. This is not some theoretical future risk we're talking about. Kuwait has already been a real active battlefield for months, with real casualties on multiple sides, well before we even get to the separate question of whether Iran might attempt an actual ground invasion. Now let's get into the new reporting that's come out since I last covered this story, because I think this is genuinely significant. 2 senior IRGC officers told the New York Times in reporting that came out just a few days ago that senior IRGC Quds force officers held direct calls with Hezbollah, Houthi, and Iraqi militia commanders during the earlier U.S. and Iran ceasefire that had been in place back in April, specifically to coordinate efforts to expand the broader conflict with the United States and increase the overall cost of American military operations in the region. Think about what that actually means. While the ceasefire was nominally in effect, giving the public impression that hostilities were paused and diplomacy had a chance to work, Iran's own IRGC was reportedly using that exact window to actively coordinate with its regional proxy network, specifically to plan how to widen the war once fighting inevitably resumed. Analysts covering this have suggested the IRGC officer's decision to reveal this to the New York Times right now is likely itself a deliberate information operation, an attempt to deter the United States and Israel from following through on reported plans to strike Iranian energy infrastructure, essentially signaling that Iran has already built out the coordination and capability to expand this war further if it comes to that, hoping that signal alone convinces American and Israeli planners the cost of further escalation isn't worth it. Let me spend some real time unpacking that IRGC to proxy coordination story, because I think it deserves a much deeper look than a single paragraph can give it. The fact that this coordination reportedly happened during an active ceasefire is, I think, the single most important detail in this entire update. A ceasefire is supposed to represent a genuine pause, a chance for both sides to step back, and typically the expectation from the public and from diplomats trying to broker something more lasting is that both sides use that window to actually explore paths toward a durable resolution. If Iran's Quds force was instead using that exact window to build out and strengthen its coordination with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Iraqi militia commanders, all specifically aimed at figuring out how to expand the conflict and raise the cost of continued American operations. That tells you the ceasefire was never treated by Iran's military leadership as a genuine step toward ending hostilities. It was treated as an operational pause to reposition and better prepare for the next phase of fighting. I think that's a really important thing for anyone hoping for a genuine diplomatic resolution to this conflict to understand, because it suggests that future ceasefires or pauses, even ones that look encouraging on the surface, may simply be repeating the same pattern, providing Iran's military apparatus room to regroup and coordinate rather than representing real progress toward peace. I also want to talk about why Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias specifically are the three proxy forces named in this reporting, because each one brings a genuinely different capability and geographic angle to a coordinated pressure campaign against the United States. Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, brings an enormous stockpile of rockets and missiles along with decades of organizational experience fighting Israel specifically, and its involvement would primarily threaten Israel and potentially U.S. assets and personnel in that specific corner of the region. The Houthis in Yemen have already demonstrated a real capability to threaten shipping through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and have separately been engaged in their own parallel conflict with Saudi Arabia. So their involvement threatens an entirely different maritime choke point from the Strait of Hormuz that's been the main flashpoint in the core U.S. and Iran conflict. And Iraqi militias, as we've discussed on this channel before, bring the most direct, sustained threat to American forces actually stationed on the ground in the region, given their history of attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq going back many years before this current war even started. Having all three of these proxy forces coordinating together, rather than acting independently as they largely have for most of this conflict, would represent a genuinely more dangerous, multi-front pressure campaign than anything Iran could achieve through its own direct military action alone, which I think is exactly the point Iran's IRGC wants both the American public and American military planners to understand and take seriously. This connects directly to the most recent threats coming out of Tehran, because an unspecified senior security official told the IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency that Iran has prepared an actual attack plan specifically targeting regional energy infrastructure in direct response to reports that Trump has ordered new strikes on Iran. The IRGC-affiliated Fars news agency reiterated this same threat and went so far as to publish a specific list of regional energy facilities that Iranian missiles can reportedly reach, and this list included oil fields and other energy infrastructure, not just in Kuwait, but in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE as well. Iran issued all of these threats specifically after Western media reported that the United States and Israel are considering large-scale strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure directly. So this is very clearly framed by Iran as a deterrence message, telling every single Gulf energy producer in the region that if the US and Israel follow through on hitting Iran's energy sector, Iran has already identified their energy infrastructure as fair game in response. And as recently as August 1st, Kuwaiti air defenses intercepted an unspecified number of Iranian drones, specifically targeting Kuwait. Again, so this isn't just rhetoric sitting on a shelf. Actual attacks against Kuwait have continued right up through the most recent reporting. I also want to spend some time on the energy infrastructure threat specifically, because I think the scale of that published target list deserves more attention. Naming energy facilities across Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE all in one list is a genuinely broad threat, essentially telling every major oil and gas producer in the Gulf region simultaneously that their critical infrastructure is on the table if the US and Israel follow through on striking Iran's own energy sector. I think it's worth remembering just how economically devastating an attack on Gulf energy infrastructure would be, not just to the specific countries targeted, but to the global economy as a whole, given how much of the world's oil and gas supply flows through this exact region. That's precisely why I think this specific threat, more than the ground invasion rhetoric, deserves the most serious attention from policymakers right now, because unlike a conventional invasion of Kuwait, which faces enormous geographic and air power obstacles, as I've explained in detail before, Iran has already repeatedly demonstrated a genuine, proven capability to launch missile and drone strikes against exactly this kind of infrastructure throughout this entire war. The capability gap between threatening to invade Kuwait and threatening to strike energy infrastructure is enormous. One requires overcoming geography and facing the most concentrated air power in the region. The other simply requires more of the exact same missile and drone tactics Iran has already been using successfully for months. Let's talk about the invasion threat specifically now, because I think there's genuinely useful new analysis out there that helps sharpen the picture beyond what I covered last time. One detailed regional security analysis laid out a specific set of indicators worth watching, and I think this is a really useful framework. Any confirmed movement of Iranian ground forces, naval transport assets, or rotary wing helicopter units toward the northern Gulf coastline would represent a genuinely significant escalation indicator, warranting an immediate shift in how seriously this threat should be classified, moving it from rhetorical to operational. On the other hand, if Iran continues relying purely on missile and drone strikes without any corresponding movement of actual ground or amphibious assets, that supports the assessment that all of this Kuwait invasion talk remains primarily a deterrence and messaging tool rather than a genuinely imminent operational plan. That same analysis made a broader point I think is worth repeating directly, that this entire conflict has entered a phase where information warfare, hostage diplomacy signaling, and targeting logistics nodes have become just as strategically significant as the actual kinetic strikes themselves, which I think is a really sharp way of framing exactly what we're watching play out with all of this Kuwait rhetoric. I also want to bring up something that's come out regarding the earlier infiltration attempt I mentioned in my previous coverage of this story, because there's more specific detail now. Back in May, Kuwaiti security forces intercepted an IRGC-linked infiltration team attempting to breach Bubiyan Island, a strategically sensitive port zone near the Iraqi frontier, and that operation ended with 4 operatives captured after a firefight that wounded a Kuwaiti soldier. That remains, as far as I can tell from the most current reporting, the only confirmed instance of actual Iranian-linked personnel physically crossing into Kuwaiti territory during this entire war. Everything beyond that specific incident continues to sit in the category of threats and rhetoric rather than confirmed operational action. I also want to bring up a really interesting historical parallel that's been getting attention recently because I think it adds a lot of emotional and strategic weight to why this specific threat lands so hard in Kuwait specifically. Kuwait was, of course, invaded and occupied by Iraq back in 1990, an event that led directly to the Gulf War and remains a defining national trauma for the country. Recent coverage has specifically framed Kuwait as Iran's softest Gulf target precisely because of that history, its proximity to Iran, and its high concentration of American troops, all combining to make it an easy target for Tehran's missiles, even though, notably, Kuwait had actually enjoyed relatively cordial relations with Iran before this war started, with hundreds of pilgrims from Kuwait's own Shia minority regularly taking direct flights to visit religious shrines inside Iran. That backdrop of previously decent relations makes the intensity and frequency of these attacks genuinely surprising to a lot of observers inside Kuwait itself. It's also worth noting that Kuwait has taken a notably less hawkish public stance against Iran throughout this conflict compared to countries like Bahrain and the UAE, with the UAE at one point even indicating it could join a naval force to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and reportedly having launched its own secret airstrikes against Iran earlier in the war. Interestingly, the UAE has more recently sought to de-escalate tensions with Tehran, and notably has not been the target of direct Iranian fire during the most recent flare-up in hostilities, which is a pretty telling data point about how Iran appears to be calibrating which Gulf countries get targeted directly based on their specific posture toward this conflict. Let me also mention something about how this conflict's geographic footprint keeps expanding in ways that go well beyond even the Kuwait question specifically. Recent analysis has pointed out that potential U.S. operations against Iranian territory have expanded in the discussion beyond just airstrikes, into conversations around targets like Karg Island, and even potential cooperation with Kurdish and other anti-regime forces inside Iran itself. That same analysis raised an important strategic point worth repeating, that the history of previous American ground wars in Vietnam, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan weighs heavily on any decision to move beyond purely air and maritime operations, especially against an adversary with as much genuine experience in ground and guerrilla warfare as Iran has. The specific argument made is that a ground attack against Iran would be difficult for the U.S. to sustain, even from multiple fronts, unless it managed to inflame Iran's own internal protests and genuinely disrupt Iranian national unity from within. I also want to touch on Kuwait's specific strategic dilemma here, because I think it's genuinely a difficult position for that country to be in. Being described as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for American power projection, as Gulf strategists have characterized it, brings enormous value to the broader American and allied military effort in the region. But it also means Kuwait bears a disproportionate share of the retaliatory risk every single time this conflict escalates, precisely because of that concentration of American bases and forces on its own soil. I think this puts Kuwait's government in a genuinely difficult position. They can't simply ask the United States to leave without fundamentally undermining decades of security relationship and their own broader defense posture. But every additional month this conflict drags on means additional risk to Kuwaiti civilians, Kuwaiti infrastructure, and Kuwaiti service members, none of whom chose to be on this particular front line, but who've ended up there anyway because of geography and because of that decades-long alliance. Let me give you my honest, updated opinion on all of this, because I think the new information available really does refine and sharpen the assessment I gave last time. The confirmed reporting about IRGC officers coordinating with Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias during that April ceasefire tells me Iran's strategy has clearly shifted from purely reactive strikes toward a much more deliberate, coordinated effort to expand this war's geographic footprint and its coalition of proxy actors, specifically as a way to raise the overall cost of continued American operations without necessarily needing to commit Iran's own conventional forces directly into a ground invasion. That's actually a pretty sophisticated strategic approach if it's accurate, using the threat of expansion and the demonstrated capability to coordinate across multiple proxy fronts as leverage, rather than actually needing to follow through on the highest cost, highest risk options, like a direct ground invasion of Kuwait. I also think the specific published list of energy infrastructure targets, spanning basically every major Gulf oil producer, tells you Iran understands exactly where its real leverage lies in this conflict, not in trying to physically seize and hold a heavily defended American base inside Kuwait, which, as I explained in my last video on this topic, remains an extremely difficult operation given the air power stacked against it, but in threatening the thing that actually matters most to the global economy and to every single government in that region, the uninterrupted flow of oil, that's a genuinely smart, asymmetric pressure strategy, and I think it's a more realistic read of where Iran's actual near-term intentions lie compared to the more dramatic ground invasion framing that keeps generating headlines. That said, I don't want to dismiss the invasion rhetoric entirely, because I think the framework that regional analysis laid out is exactly the right way to think about this going forward. Watch for actual movement of ground forces, naval transport, or helicopter assets toward the northern Gulf, and treat that specific indicator as the real line between rhetoric and genuine operational planning. Absent that kind of confirmed movement, and given that Iran has continued relying almost exclusively on missiles and drones, including that most recent August 1st drone attack against Kuwait, I think the invasion talk remains primarily a deterrence and messaging tool, exactly as that analysis suggested, rather than a credible imminent operational plan. I also want to acknowledge, before wrapping up, that reporting built on statements from IRGC-affiliated outlets like Tasneem and Fars News specifically deserves a healthy degree of skepticism, since those outlets exist in part to serve Iran's own information warfare objectives, and a published list of targets is exactly the kind of thing a government might release specifically to maximize psychological pressure on its adversaries, regardless of whether every single facility on that list actually represents a genuine near-term operational target. So here's my bottom line on all of this. Kuwait has already paid a real documented price in this war, dozens of casualties, downed aircraft, a tragic friendly fire incident, and continued missile and drone attacks right up through the first days of August. The new reporting about IRGC coordination with regional proxies during the April ceasefire tells me Iran's strategy has shifted toward deliberately expanding this conflict's cost and geographic reach through its proxy network, rather than relying purely on direct action. And the specific threat against Gulf energy infrastructure, published as an explicit list of targets, tells me Iran's most credible near-term leverage remains economic pressure on the global oil supply, not a conventional invasion that geography and American air power still make extremely difficult to pull off. I'd keep watching for that specific indicator, confirmed ground, naval, or helicopter force movement toward Kuwait, as the real signal that this threat has moved from rhetoric into something genuinely operational. I'll keep tracking this story closely, especially given how quickly things seem to be developing on the energy infrastructure threat side of this. What do you guys think? Do you believe Iran is more likely to actually attempt something against Kuwait directly? Or do you think this stays in the realm of pressure and messaging the way it has so far? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If this updated breakdown helped you understand where things actually stand, go ahead and hit that like button for me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next update. And follow me on X and Instagram, where I'm posting on this pretty much daily as it develops. Links in the description below. And go ahead and check out the video right here. I think you'll enjoy it. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot next door, signing off.